Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Missoula Art Museum's first education webinar, Decolonizing the Museum. My name is Jenny, and I am the Educator and Outreach Specialist here at MAM. I'd like to begin tonight by reading MAM's Tribal Acknowledgement Statement that was developed in collaboration with local tribal leaders. MAM is situated on the traditional ancestral territories of the Salish and Pend Oreille peoples. MAM is committed to respecting the indigenous stewards of the land it occupies. Their rich cultures are fundamental to artistic life in Montana and to the work of MAM. Tonight, I'll be in conversation with Asia Mujinga Sherrard, a dynamic speaker, artist, and art history professor. Asia has been teaching art history and studio art at the University of Montana Western for the past 3 years. Starting this fall, she will be relocating to Austin, Texas to pursue a PhD in art history and diaspora studies. Welcome, Asia, and thank you for being with us tonight.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an absolute pleasure. And now that I've stumbled on the first word, hopefully that's the last.
It's all downhill from here. I'm gonna just take a minute to situate our conversation. And then I'm going to turn it over to you with the first question. So tonight, Asia is going to be helping us put this current issue of decolonization into context for our own museum. She's going to be showing us some slides, taking questions from you, and giving context for our Love Letters to the Collection exhibition. And Love Letters is a very special year-long exhibition that opened in March, just moments before the pandemic forced MAM to temporarily close to the public. The exhibition features pieces from MAM's contemporary American Indian art collection, selected by guest curators, including artists, writers, poets, tribal leaders, elected officials, activists, scholars, and students. Each of these guest curators writes a love letter to their chosen artwork, and these letters are displayed alongside the art in MAM's Contemporary American Indian Art Gallery, the Linda M. Frost Gallery. So when you visit MAM, when our doors are open again, you will often see contemporary American Indian art on view in any of our exhibition spaces, but you will always find it in the Frost Gallery. For this exhibition, MAM is inviting audience and community feedback, insights, and interpretation to be part of the exhibition. The audience is invited to share why you find certain pieces powerful through a writing station, the art cart, postcards, social media hashtags, and emails that can be sent directly to the collection objects. MAM will gather all the comments and display them throughout the run of the exhibition and add them to the object's permanent record. MAM is grateful for the generous exhibition sponsorship by Noteworthy Press. So we will be inviting everyone to participate virtually in this exhibition, both until our doors are open and after, through our Teachable site, which we're going to drop the link into the chat. If you want to go there, you can view all of the art and the letters and contribute your own letter on that site. So that was a lot. Our format for tonight is going to be in 3 parts. Each part will be kicked off with a question, and then Asia will share her thoughts, images, we'll take your questions. So if questions occur to you, please just type them in the chat and we'll relay them to Asia as part of the conversation. So Asia, our first question for tonight, we want to kick off with, unless you want to say anything before we start.
I think that's wonderful. I love starting with a question.
Okay, great. First question is, what do we mean when we talk about the decolonization movement in the museum world?
Right, so to begin, I'm going to start sharing my screen. So talk about the decolonization of the movement in the museum world is actually a compound question with a couple of other questions inside of it, right? The first one is, what is colonization? And then we want to talk about why institutions such as museums are considered expansions of that colonization in some ways. And then again, why it matters and why there's so many people making posters like the one that you see here on the screen, insisting that museums take ownership for the colonization. The viewers of those museums, the guests of those museums, and the artists who are buoyed by those museums all take all of this under consideration. So to sort of begin that conversation, colonization is sort of the imposition of one's hegemony over the culture of others in a abstractions. Every culture has had its own sense of believing that it is the center of its world, which is normal enough. It's part of our psychology, right? The problem is when we impose the belief that we are the center of their worlds as well. And this is what we talk about when we talk about colonization in this sort of new theoretical space. Actively, it's the extraction of resources from a land other than our own in the hope of concentrating that global wealth to one place or to that one hegemonic center. And that extraction of resources obviously includes things like minerals, gold, and spices, and products and salt, things that are taken directly out of the earth. But as a really interesting book, the sort of Billion Black Anthropocenes or None sort of points out, is that extraction is also humanity. And we know this through systems of slavery, that it is an extraction of human labor, but it is also an extraction of human projects and human creation, as well as human identity and subjectivity also gets extracted from those countries as colonialism expands. And that's where the institutions become really relevant. If we're extraction of resources, both literal and figurative, or both mineral and human, out of a culture, oftentimes it is the museums who are more embroiled in the extraction of cultural resources from a nation or peoples. They extract a kind of a visual identity. They extract a kind of self-knowledge or self-building objects. They extract who someone is and how they conceive of themselves through the materials and objects that they leave behind. And the same way that when you extract mineral for industrial purpose, you fundamentally change the structure of that mineral. Oftentimes, that extraction of human resources and its housing inside of institutions fundamentally changes those things as well. And because museums are where these cultural treasures are held, those museums have a deep history of involvement in how exactly that extraction is used. We could say the factory is how the extraction of mineral is brought back into the settler colonial culture, or how the extraction of that sort of human resource ends up being on display for settler culture as well, at least historically, which is how those institutions end up embroiled in the conversation to begin with. And then the question is, why does it matter? Well, because it still has impact on the way that people live today. The story of colonialism is not over, and the people who have experienced colonialism are still living with the ghosts of that colonialism today. And it is of great importance to us who have been sort of these post-colonial bodies or these colonized histories to take under consideration how our human resources are taken from us or repurposed for dominant culture. And this leads us to systems of activism that bring this conversation about why this is so important to the foreground. And as you can see from some of the flyers here by a activist group known as Decolonize This Place, they operate under a hashtag as well as and through some direct actions, obviously thinking very intentionally about the images that produces and how images create conversations in culture today. You can see them using specific language that is asking for the museum to be decolonized as a structure and as a space. They're also tying the act of the museum, or the sort of presence of the museum, to other systems of colony. So in some cases, they talk about the extraction of actual wealth in the form of physical objects. How was this acquired? Thinking about the sort of imperial collection of objects and its housing in the library, in the museums, as well as thinking about the actual value of those things and how they no longer belong to the people who might be able to utilize that material wealth as well as that philosophical wealth. Settler colonialism is a term that we see often in colonial conversations, and it refers to that sort of sense of colonialism and extraction that also includes the settling of the colonizing peoples in the lands that they've colonized, not simply extraction, but also extraction and replacing in terms of stepping into that space. And we see a lot of settler colonial activities sort of protected the bodies of museums, which is what you're seeing this activism respond to here. Obviously, the ways that people are affected by this comes through really strongly, and we see some of that happening here as well. In some cases, we also have museums sort of called to task for the foundation of wealth that built them, not just the objects that they've collected into those permanent collections that might be of sort of imperial background, but also thinking about how museums as institutions are often tied to economies that they're themselves settler colonial, extracting resources from other parts of the world, or developing their wealth from political activities that are seen as adverse to some of the activity or activism around protection of people and protection of their dignity. As you can see from some of the protests around the Whitney Museum and the Met, both in the sense of these posters and in some of the slogans here, some of these activists are calling the Whitney to task for one of the founders or curators' relationship to making money from the gas that was used on immigrating families at the southern US border, and saying that someone whose wealth is coming from this place is not a responsible member of an institution that is meant to uphold the dignity and free intellectual cross borders. And so there's a lot of conversations in which the wider conversations we have around wealth and dignity and extraction are also then sometimes threaded into the way that we talk about larger institutions like museums. And then, as you can see, in this sort of strange movement that is, like so many of our movements today, really built around a phrase and a hashtag. Most of what I found were a few articles, all of which had a link to buy a t-shirt at the bottom. And we can talk a little bit about consumerism and activism here too, if we want to go into a digression. But what this t-shirt slogan points out very intelligently, along with some of the supporting articles, is that museums are not neutral, but they are often positioned as neutral, as sort of responsible brokers of knowledge from one culture to another, oftentimes from the culture of the other to the culture of the normal, but not necessarily. And as Gerardo Mosquera says very intelligently in his essay, The Marco Polo Syndrome, is that one of the worst problems of the Southern Hemisphere is its lack of internal integration and horizontal communication between two different cultures or nations on that sort of Southern Hemisphere. And now he's using the terms North and South here very loosely. He's using South to mean the global South or the colonized world, and he's using North to refer to the global North, or the sort of Euro-American center of hegemonic power in our current colonial or post-colonial systems. So these are loose terms, but essentially what he's saying is that colonized peoples no longer have the ability to speak directly to each other if they have to visit each other's work through museums that are chaired and brokered by people only from one culture, and one culture that has imposed a sense of hegemony on others historically. What he asks for in his essay is for there to be more horizontal conversation, where a Native American can have a conversation with an indigenous Japanese person, or where an African member of the Ife tribe can have a conversation with a Cuban American without having a white curator be the introducer, the person who brokers that relationship between them, at least not if that white curator is assuming that they are a neutral party in that relationship and exchange, that they are not actually translating all of that artwork from one culture into the next and risking a kind of loss in translation in the process. This question of neutrality is also coming down to that sense of hierarchy. The museum knows and you don't. The museum teaches you because we have a sort of unique and objective knowledge, and you come here to learn. If that's the dynamic, then it undercuts the ability of people to own their own stories, to tell their own stories, and to frame the cultural projects that they create, or products that they create, within the cosmology and the epistemology, the systems of knowledge and the lifeways that are true to those original objects. It also makes it really hard for us to be critical about language. When we communicate, we try to communicate as effectively as possible, which often means that we use terms that seem as wide open to as many people as possible, and frequently those terms are defanged. We'll see a lot of labels where people refer to an internment camp rather than a death camp, because that term is a little bit more passable. And because of that sort of choice in terms of terminology, it's really hard to look at, say, the term internment camp instead of a death camp or a work camp critically, because someone had to make a sort of public discussion, but because they're positioning themselves as neutral and objective, that actually biased or leading language does not get interrogated for its own sort of political and psychological needs, which again just makes it hard for us to speak back and makes it hard for the museum to be fully understood as one more member of a very complicated system of intercultural exchange. So that was quite a long babble. I don't know if we have some questions coming through the chat yet, or if you want to lead into our next section with
that. We don't have a question yet. So if you're watching and you do have a question, be sure and pop it in there, and we will, but we'll just pass on to our next question. Actually, thank you for that definition, Asia. I actually learned a lot during that, that conversation that I didn't even know already too. So thank you for that. My next question is, how might decolonization impact exhibitions?
Okay. So what you've actually seen me sort of slide through, because I added it late enough to forget that it was there, a little bit about how we've already been responding to these problems, right? As Shalene Kashmiri talks about, part of the project of decolonization is looking at deconstructing that Eurocentric view, or what I'd sort of talked about, this sort of hegemonic imposition of centrality on others, right? And that means to break down the sort of central point of a European I and then the global they or them into more of a we, and a very loose one, right? Shifting the standard from white cisgendered men to an understanding that there is standard and a pluralism, so that the complexity of being is not so easily organized.
Then can I jump in real quick? We're getting one comment in the chat. Please slow down if possible. I know. So I just wanted to share that.
I'll try to bring the pace back down. So what we see here as one of the ways in which people are responding to these problems has been a system of artist-led movements that work outside of the institution to bring critiques to the institution. We see perfect examples of that. Guerrilla girls who see their feminist work as deeply embedded with anti-colonial work. And so while a lot of the Guerrilla Girls advertising campaigns frequently outside of the institutions, but since then absorbed into these institutions, you might notice down here that it says this comes from the Tate Museum. Is they're working from outside of institutional sanction initially to bring up these issues that they see in terms of inequality or bias. We also see artists rejecting museums and artistic institutions like Adrian Piper, who produced her Mythic Being series initially by publishing it in the Village Voice as an advertisement, finding ways to distribute her artistic ideas well outside of curation and the biases of curation. Obviously, if we look at the covers of the Black Panther newspaper, as well as inserts, we do see some really galvanizing visual culture come through here, outside, again, of the sanctions of display. Emory Douglas was producing these when very few museums were publishing African-American artwork or hosting African-American artists, and the ones that they were artists who were more in line with the rules of abstraction and less political, which to Emory Douglas was problematic as well. We see projects like this that are installed in the street. This is in Canada. In this case, it is translated. If you want to learn something, first you must learn this. Many of these posters are not, which forces a sense of subjectivity on people who are usually experiencing their lives as the center, the person always being spoken to by advertisements. And this sort of act of public rejection, that this is simply not for you if you can't understand it, is a radical and artistic act that happens again outside of the museum itself. And of course, we've seen a rich history of performance outside of the museum. But our question was, how does this idea of plurality of voices impact exhibitions? And we can also see artists doing really incredible work where they're bringing up these problems of the institution and its role in colonization and its role in maintaining Eurocentrism and the supremacy of Euro-American thought. by actually working directly with those museums and producing exhibitions that respond to some of those problems, and therefore collaborating, the institution and the artist, on this critique that helps bring up some of the old problems of the institution and hold the institution accountable within its own doors and to its own audience. We see that very strongly in Fred Wilson's work, who's notoriously aware of the museum as a political space. He was a museum guard for quite some time and was really interested in his both hypervisibility and complete invisibility as a museum guard. The guard uniform made him irrelevant to the exhibition, but also put him on display in a way that made him really curious and really frustrated. In this piece, Guarded View, he sort of brings this up for us by having installed in the museum a series of headless guards, sort of made invisible by their uniform or made depersonalized by their uniform, in the uniforms of various museums in New York. This piece came out shortly around a performance piece called My Life as a Dog, which is far more interesting, I think, to me than the visual that we tend to accompany it with. And this was a moment where he already had a reputation as an artist, and people came to see him give a talk and a tour of the museum. They knew that they were coming to see Fred Wilson. They knew Fred Wilson was an artist whose time they wanted to share, and he came and met them as himself, and then briefly excused himself and told them that he would meet them in the gallery. When he reemerged in the gallery, it was quietly, passively, and in the uniform of a guard, and it took some time before the people who had just met him earlier and who were meeting him as an artist for this talk recognized that it was him in uniform, which really spoke to that invisibility and some of the racial politics of institutions and who we imagine art is for and who we imagine the guard's role is, specifically when so many guards in New York museums are Black and so many of the museum attendees themselves are white. So there's a racial disparity sort of built into those norms there. His work was speaking very highly or very strongly about who thinks museums belong to them and who goes with a sense of ownership and a sense of welcome. Other work of his included interrogating the collections of museums. In this piece, he worked with the Maryland Historical Society collection to reassemble the items in their collection and to force some conversations through juxtaposition. We can see here that this metalwork case then also holds the shackle of a slave and interrogates Maryland's racial history as well as the museum's racial history in terms of what it had for display and what those cases normally looked like, ignoring some items and presenting others in order to tell one kind of narrative instead of this more complex one. James Luna made a stunning piece that is still very much worth talking about, which was known as the artifact piece. He was speaking to the tendency of certain museums, specifically historical museums or anthropological museums, to have human remains in their collections that had been removed from their graves, and those human remains would oftentimes be on display with other items from those graves. Then in some cases, those human remains would be repatriated, but the objects that had been intended for them in their graves were not, and those were kept. So there were some interesting and difficult conversations to be had around how we respect the dead, whose dead we respect, and how museums can interrupt some of our notion of leaving people alone and leaving people to rest, caught in the difficult space of how do we advocate for people and the beauty of the things they created without actually sort of ignoring or risking ignoring the value of death and of resting and of not being visible. He was also speaking to the larger issues surrounding Indigenous American men and the way that they fall under serious stereotypes and certain presumptions are often made about him just on what is actively visible to people. Therefore, he sort of performed both of those problems, the human remains in museum cases and the way that people felt like they could read him in the same way that they would read any available knowledge to them, by putting himself in a museum case for a performance that lasted an hour or so in a series of performances, and you can see here the signs next to him point to specific parts of his body, a scar or a burn, and associate those scars or burns to the things that happened in his life, and specifically things that happened in his life that might lean into existing stereotypes, sort of unveiling himself and the availability of his body to stereotype, especially in institutional spaces like this. Oluwagwibe did a piece that was a little bit more sarcastic. This piece is largely spoken about in terms of the weight of this fieldstone and the value of this fieldstone in the room. I've found it myself very subversive, looking at the number of non-art objects that end up in art museums under the term art because they've been removed from their own context, which gave them meaning, and turned into art through this recontextualization. Oftentimes we think, to the fountain by Marcel Duchamp, that really the fountain benefits from becoming an art object. It would have been an item of no importance, but now it's art, and now we speak about it. And in that sense, the value of that object is elevated. However, if we look at things that are embedded in someone's sense of self, in someone's understanding of their relationship to the divine, and then we take something like that that is so central to a life way or to a belief or sense of the sacred, and we bring it into a wall and into a museum and hang it in the wall, stripped of its color, stripped of the natural fibers that frame it, stripped of the dancer who would have been within it, and stripped of all the context that gave it that spiritual value, breaking it down to simply a collection of forms or material surfaces, we lose more perhaps than we gain in terms of the value then of that object. And if we think about these relationships, a sort of deadening of objects as they come into museum collections, Oluwagwibe is sort of having a sarcastic and somewhat subversive move, taking something that exists in the mundane reality of New England and bringing it and artifying it in the museum as a Nigerian artist himself who was coming in as an outsider, who was taking something that he has found on the ground and who's representing it to that same audience with the authority to have transformed it into artwork in the process, essentially playing a role that we have seen white anthropologists and art curators play without necessarily being as fully aware of how strange that act might be. In an interesting series by a collective of artists known as the Will Brown Collective that I had the pleasure to meet when I was in San Francisco, they also pointed to the sort of strangeness of institutions and the appropriate structures of how one values art or believes that art is allowed to exist within the artistic structure by hosting a exhibition of artworks that were not allowed to exist in the basement of their San Francisco gallery. As you can see, none of these artworks are visible. All of them are blotted with these sort of bright pink squares in a black and white photo, itself kind of an interesting image. And all of these were acquired or displayed through strange means. One of them, for example, which I believe is hinted over here, is the head of a sculpture by a famous artist who, walking through his exhibition at the last minute, decided his sculpture would have been better without a head, snapped it off and handed it to the museum assistant who had been working there. She is not allowed to sell it. She has no rights of ownership over this expensive piece of sculpture. It is not the sculpture, but rather the piece that has been broken off. And so there's no paper trail that allows this object to exist within the art world in its own bureaucracy. However, it is an object and she owns it. And because the artist who built this collective had enough of these anecdotes in their larger artistic community, they decided to present these sort of inappropriate or illegitimate art objects in this sort of below ground display, helping point to questions about what legitimacy looks like in the art world to begin with. And then in one of these sort of museum interrogations, an artist known as Chris Poppin came into the Field Museum and drew on the museum, or drawing on tradition, sort of entering these cases and presenting his own drawings in between the audience and the objects that have been collected by the Field Museum, sort of acting himself as the broker between the audience and institution in the same way that institutions have been acting as the broker between this tribal memory and contemporary American audiences. And there's some very beautiful images from that exhibition. You have a better idea of his drawings here, certainly working with the history of ledger art and ledger drawings through his use of ledgers and his use of maps and his own imagery over top of it. And you can see here how these sort of enlarged ledger drawings and prints are stepping in and sort of interrupting our relationship to traditional museum displays. The Field Museum also opened up an exhibition that was co-curated by Bunky Echohawk, a contemporary artist who rewrote some of the labels for some of the artwork that he was working with and sort of pointing to larger issues in Native American society as a way to educate not only on visual traditions and a larger sense of generalized history, but contemporary and serious issues. We have an example of that here, where this painting by Bunky Echohawk comes along with this description of suicide rate and some of the very difficult emotional burdens that sort of fall on some colonized peoples, including his own family. And then I wanted to bring up Sarah Sistream, someone who I was very, very excited to meet several years ago when the MAM hosted her in your Contemporary Art Gallery. And while her paintings were stunningly beautiful and her baskets are really brilliant, one of the things that I was mostly excited about was the narrative that stitched these together. Obviously, we can see the sort of presence of beadwork and the presence of certain colors in her paintings. But as her studio became noxious from using high toxicity paint in a somewhat underventilated space, she was pushed away from painting where she'd found the stride and into looking for new forms of artwork. She is from the Hanisku Nation, which is currently very small. There are very few enrolled tribal members in the Hanisku. And she realized that there are certain weaving traditions that have been lost from the living members of that nation, but which are preserved in museum collections. As someone who has access to museum collections as an artist and as an art critic and curator, she entered some of these collections and essentially retaught herself some of these traditions by analyzing the ancient objects in those museums and revitalized these weaving traditions down to harvesting the right plants and spending time in harvest with old traditions of borrowing and asking and thanking the ground for the plant she's bringing in. And in some of these places where she exposes these baskets, they're fully woven, sometimes they're partially woven, and oftentimes she'll often expose them with bundles of the cedar bark or straw that she's using to create these as well. In addition to making them for herself, she's also been doing workshops where other members of her nation are relearning how to create these objects as well. And so there is this project of revitalization and survivance coming through this artist's curiosity about her own history, as well as her ability to use her skills as an artist to analyze and sort of bring back into the contemporary world these objects, just as a sense of context for who she is. One of the things that's most interesting for what we're talking about here is that she's also worked with museums to renegotiate their relationships to stolen artifacts, or to artifacts whose recontextualization in museums has deadened something about their core value to the people who made them. She's been talking and brokering relationships between these institutions and the nations whose objects these are that allow the institutions to transition from the owner of these objects to the sort of caregiver of these objects. There's a better word, but I'm blanking at the moment. I'm sure that Jenny will be able to jump in soon with that one. But
I'm not sure what the word is that you're searching for, but I am really interesting. It's interesting the way you're sort of segueing from, you know, there's the critical, like the museum as the curator as the broker, the curator as the translator, which is sort of not what we want to have happen, and then transitioning to the curator as the caregiver, or the some other nurturing word that we can't quite grasp right now. But it makes me think of something we talk about a lot at MAM, which is amplifying the artist's voice, that our job is it's artists first. And so that I like that you're touching on that idea. Yeah.
Absolutely. And sort of curator as owner of an exotic collection to curator broker between this collection and its audience into curator as a collaborator with these artists and with the nations who are presenting some of these objects or the peoples who are presenting these objects. And then sort of the curator as a steward or a caretaker for these objects, right? And in order to sort of transition from owner or broker into steward, Sarah Systrom has been working with some of these institutions and communities to create appropriate means of holding these objects. So what does this object need? What is its recontextualized reality? And what does it take to actually treat it like the living being that in many cases these objects are? Do they need to be handled? Do they need to be kept in some place warm or someplace less sterile? Do they need to be saged? How often? Do they need to be danced with? How often, right? And so she's actually been brokering some of these relationships, bringing spiritual leaders into the museum to dance pieces back into the collection, to handle these pieces in ceremony the way that they were meant to be handled, and then to replace them into these gallery cases so that people can observe them when they're resting as well. In some cases, that means that certain objects need to be protected from sight, may belong to the museum, but not be on display because they are seen as beings who need rest. And others, it means that that display is there, but it is displayed with the sanction of the tribal members who survive and who know what these objects need if they consider them within the context of sort of their life and their existence, right? Which for me was some of the most exciting work I've ever heard of. And I'm really excited, hopefully, to connect with Sarah Systrom more and do a little bit more work on that and sort of exploring part of the work that she's been doing. But I know that that talk was given at the MAM, so I believe there might be a link or some record of it available at some point. And for me, I think this is one of the most transformative examples of how exhibitions are changing and how the role of the curator is changing, not only by interacting with the artists themselves who are critical and inviting that criticism into the body of the museum, but also thinking about how curators can transition their own role by not only talking to artists, but also to audiences and also to larger communities that are implicated in those museums and how these museums are communicating.
Asia, I'm going to jump in. We have a question that actually builds on exactly what you're talking about right now. So I'm going to throw it in. They're asking, could you touch on how, as a patron, we should handle museums/exhibitions that may have lost their core values or that seem problematic in their cultural appropriation and colonialism?
And I think that's an excellent question. I think sort of the root of that question is, where do I enter in this conversation? How large is my voice in this conversation? And part of the breakdown that we have to sort of go through is unlearning the hierarchy, that the museum is an institution that has the power of time, of age, of tradition, of education and knowledge behind all of its decisions. It's very difficult to stand up to our parents and say, I think you're wrong about the way that you are doing this, because we're so integrated in this sense that you wouldn't be a parent if you didn't know. And we have to do the same thing when we come into an institution as well. There is sort of in the walls of the institution, we know that our museums are oftentimes some of the most beautiful buildings that we enter. They have the kind of authority that beautiful buildings have, the hollowed halls. We know, most of us entering into a museum, that there's a way in which you shrink your body in a little bit. You cross your arms in to make sure that you don't touch anything, and you're more aware of your proximity to walls and objects than you probably are anywhere else. Maybe this was taught to you when you first went to museums. Maybe you learned it under somewhat duress because you didn't go to museums early, and because there's a kind of fear of the institution and your own awareness of, perhaps I don't belong here, perhaps this isn't my institution, that helps contain you. And part of the work of the museum is to start breaking down some of that sort of heavy authority and to allow people to take up a little bit more room, not just in how they move through space, but how they move through the questions that they have and the feelings they have in response to not only the work that they see, but also the context of that work in that institution. And part of our job as members of a museum community, whether we are guest curators or patrons or simply people who are walking by, is to allow ourselves to forget or to unlearn the authority of the institution and take up a little bit more room and trust our own voice. If we're not in a place where there is one voice at the apex and the rest of those voices are them, but rather we are a large collective of we, with varying senses of context and various knowledge, some of which is very important, even if we're not used to seeing it that way, then we can start asking bigger questions. Then we can start demanding different things. Not in the sense that we need to overpower some of the conversations that are necessarily being had. This doesn't have to become a screaming match, but it certainly can become a conversation where one expects to be heard and speaks as though they expect to be heard and speaks with a real interest in listening, and invites other voices into that conversation at the same time. I hope that helps answer the question somewhat.
That was great. I mean, that makes total sense. I hope to our audience too. And it makes me think about one thing that we work on a lot at MAM, which is our radical welcome, which is the way that we try to take down all the barriers to access by having free admission and the types of outreach that we do. We're trying to break down, I mean, in our museum, you enter like at ground level. There are no going up the steps to look up, you know, even though we do have those steps because we're a repurposed Carnegie Library. But I just think that's an interesting like illustration of everybody enters, we're all on ground level when we walk in the door.
Yeah, and in the lobby, that is sort of what you experience first, instead of coming up to a sterile counter before you're allowed to cross the doors into the artwork. I think also definitely changes the way that people feel coming into the space, right? They're not being kept out of the room until they can pass the, give the right code or present the right personage, but rather they are in the room when they walk in.
Yeah. We do make them put down their water bottles though.
They're it in, but it's more like asking someone to take their shoes off when they're already inside the house.
Exactly. Yeah. So great. So we're doing so great for time. I'm going to transition to our third question, if that's okay with you, which is, yep, we're right on time. Let's talk specifically about Love Letters to the Collection and how this exhibition embodies these ideas of decolonization and the plurality of voices.
Mm-hmm. And I think that it really comes down to this question of plurality of voices. We've talked a little bit, and I keep doing this with my hands, about the notion of having a central voice to which all other voices are peripheral, or a plurality or a multitude of voices, none of which are necessarily any larger or any more central than the others. I have this conversation often with my students when I try to characterize art history, which is to say that we are not moving through a line where there is a beginning and an end, right? But rather through a constellation where every time we try to draw a story, we are connecting dots that are actually sort of in latitude, and we're always going to miss a few in the process. And how this becomes relevant in a sort of postmodern understanding of art, the art world, and a sort of critical understanding of the art world is that there's no one voice that has a natural authority above others, including the voice or the collective voice of the institution. Now, does that mean the institutions should come apart entirely? Probably not. Like we mentioned, there is this quality of sort of caregiving that in some cases is necessary. Putting these things out on the rain would not keep them any safer, and we do have a sort of collective desire to see artwork and to have access to artwork and to have access to these conversations. But it also comes back to this question of how we structure these conversations and how we break down the notion of a central voice or a plural one, simply by taking time to listen, no matter who we are and how we enter, and taking time to learn with the sense that you also have something to teach. There's a really beautiful quote here by Eliza Schoenberger when she was talking about decolonizing exercises and sort of summarized them in terms of how to move forward. And she writes that it's not just about inviting Indigenous and other marginalized people into the museums or inviting them to help improve those exhibitions. It's overhauling the whole system, the presumption of the institution. Otherwise, museums are just replicating systems of colonization using tokenism or sort of externalizing or extracting labor in order to improve themselves without a real sense of who their audience is or how their audience is changing. And what I think works about the love letters to the exhibition is that it is an overhaul or an unraveling of the presumption of institution. The presumption of institution, when you walk up these marble steps, is that this is a house of authority. It knows. The text on the wall is neutral and objective. It is true in its essential sense, and specifically to the sort of critic of literary exercise, each of these words is the most honest and obvious word to describe something. When you come into the love letters of the exhibition, instead of having a single person who is trying to perform the sense of an objective center of a conversation, or someone who is able to tell an essential or absolute truth about something, there's a sort of proactive listening where we say, what do you see and how do you speak and what can you produce that also gets to take up physical room in these spaces? How can you participate in a conversation as well as receive a conversation? And that sort of more active response speaks to that sense of plurality. We can look a little bit at what we have here in terms of the way that this is opened up to us, right? And while it looks somewhat cavernous now, unfortunately COVID has kept us out of this room physically, we can do a little bit of imaginative thinking and feel like, what does a chair offer, right? When you see a chair at a desk, when you see things out for you, does it invite you in? Or does it push you out? Look at something blankly at the wall and it sort of tells you how your body should stand in relation to it. Looking at a chair allows your body to relax, and it allows your body to sort of drop into something, and the physical experience of how one stands holding themselves in or sits and makes contact with parts of the museum, if only the chair, is going to change something fundamental about how you think your body should be worn here. Being able to produce something in the room is also going to change your mental state from receiving to actually producing or actually giving, and being able to give it back to the museum, knowing that it is of value to that museum, that it is part of the exhibition rather than protest or trinket, that it actually allows you to feel like a contributor to what that museum means and to the sort of larger story of that museum. And we see a lot of other artworks that have been really meaningful to people, and I didn't think to make a slide of this, but if you look at something like the Post Secret Project, that sort of belongs to every person who submits one of these postcards rather than to the single person who opened up the conversation to begin with. If you look at some of the photographic projects initiated by JR, where he now produces photographic projects for others, there is this sense of becoming a collaborator with a larger public, where you are now the host of a conversation rather than the center of the conversation or the authority in that conversation. And I think that's what Love Letters to the Collection is doing in a lot of ways. Also, it allows us to start seeing different voices, and it gives us an opportunity to really foreground what the Missoula Art Museum has always done very well, which is to dedicate space to Indigenous American artists and contemporary Indigenous American artists who are themselves, like Fred Wilson or James Luna, always sort of speaking back to those institutions in certain ways, or taking up room for their own experience and occupying the sort of visual space of the museum in order to exist in that museum in a sort of unsuppressed way, which I think is really beautiful. And we can see here in the sort of series of these, how these pieces have sort of incurred various responses from their curators, some more factual, some more emotional, but they really change the variety of tone from explanation to also response. And in one case, which I don't think I'll open the link for you, but I encourage you to, down here there is a video where there is music along with this letter, and that sort of opens up different sensory responses and different ways in which responding can look and feel. Not necessarily a text, not necessarily an image, but any thing that is a kind of return of energy or a return of creation to these artworks is opening up what we think these discussions are supposed to look like, and not requiring that these discussions be academic for them to exist in the space. Hopefully that answers.
Yeah, no, that's great, Asia. And I also wanted to add that back to the sort of photo of the empty-ish gallery, this exhibition is going to be up for an entire year. So artwork is going to be added. We just began in March, and I think now we're up to maybe 7 pieces, but they haven't all been installed yet because we haven't been able to have access to the to the space. So you can see some of them here. Here's the art cart too, where there's some materials. It's also kind of a revolutionary thing to have art materials in the gallery. So we've also got some collage materials and things there where folks can draw their responses or create them in other ways that are maybe not verbal. Because we all have different ways of responding, and we also wanted to be sensitive to include options that might be traditional in different Native cultures that might not be, you know, a written verbal response. So we wanted to open up all avenues for responding.
Absolutely. I think one of the things, and we'll stop talking and take questions because I'm really interested in hearing how these questions form. But one of the things that I think is really important to hear as a patron also is that being asked to break rules takes bravery. And here the institution is saying, okay, this once, these rules have changed. Step into this new and somewhat terrifying space of a set of rules you might not be as familiar with, or a set of rules you might not fully understand. Stepping into a response to an artwork within a museum that is more traditionally academic and allowing yourself to produce a non-academic response to that work, to change your thinking from my job here is to passively see and to quietly accept whatever either the wall text or the artist has presented me with, and to suppress my own responses because they don't belong here, to actually doing that much more difficult work of saying, okay, I've been spoken to, what answers do I have? What responses do I have? These are characterized as love letters, and I think every conversation we have is somewhat loving, because to give someone your attention and to give someone a response when they give you something is essentially a generous act, even if you're frustrated when doing so. But it is also just about the act of generosity and of participation and of the bravery of breaking these systems down, because the museum cannot break them down by themselves. You cannot have a conversation change with only one person changing their mode. And without the sort of consent of the audience, the museum cannot change. It is a system that polices itself by interaction, and it is the interaction that defines that system. So while museums have an incredible burden of responsibility in terms of how they lean into that institutional authority or insist on or maintain that institutional authority, there's a strange secondary burden to those people who collaborate with the museum to allow the rules to be different, to do the brave thing of existing within this new and very different set of expectations, and to push back and to accept invitations to behave badly according to expected rules of how the museum is supposed to function, right? And I can be extremely anecdotal about how I fully understand the value of emotional information and how there is some really important intellectual work that happens in more emotional forms of expression, and I still find myself leaning into academic authority whenever I want to communicate, because I trust it more, because I feel safer sort of occupying space when I have the authority of academic presentations backing me up, than when I come forward with tears or with anxiety or with something that is incoherent or unacceptable in our sort of set standards of what is valuable, unvaluable by expectations. I understand the radical act of breaking these rules, and it's difficult to do so. So when I say step up and do something strange and respond to a piece of artwork, even if that's against the rules, I don't do so easily. I do that out of my own awareness of how complicated it can be to step into a place of authority and flout it, even when we're invited to do so.
Well, and even just, it's making me think, even when we have tours and we practice the inquiry method, where we always start by inviting folks to just look and notice and wonder and share what they're noticing. And even crossing that threshold for many people who are used to being in the passive role of having the authority tell you is challenging. It's scary to just step out and say, this is what I think, or this is what I see or notice. So I think we're so grateful to the public, the members of our audiences who have written love letters, either via the Teachable platform or in real life, because it is a little bit scary to step outside and be like, yes, I do accept the authority that I can comment on this piece from whatever my background is or my level of understanding or interest.
Yeah, we can talk about the trouble with being silenced, and there is real trouble with being silenced. But it is also difficult to speak when you are no longer silenced. And that takes work and it takes bravery, right? To actually step out of a consistently silencing world and to find something to say and then to use it to say something.
Yeah, well, we don't have any more questions, but we do have another one comment from someone that they very much enjoyed the webinar and the talk. And I'm sure we'll get more comments after. This is going to continue to live on Facebook, on our Facebook page, so folks can view it after the fact. And of course, you can go to the Teachable site and see all of the artwork, read all of the love letters that you glimpsed a moment ago, and hear the music and the poetry that's been contributed. And oh, here's another one. Thanks, Asia and ma'am. Great to see you all and great conversation. And for everyone who's listening, there is a poll, and Joe just popped it into the chat where you can offer feedback on this webinar. It is our first, and we are hoping to do many more. And now that everything is virtual, Asia, even when you're in Texas, we can still have you at MAM.
Wonderful. Hopefully I will do nothing but become a better and more informed speaker through this long exercise of becoming a student again. I'm really excited. Thank you so much for bringing me in. Again, I'm always very honored to be a member of the MAM community, also to help you introduce new projects. So I'm honored to be here. Thank you so much for your time, and thank you for your curiosity.
Well, thank you for being here. And we have a couple more comments. I'm motivated to discover this exhibit. Congrats, Asia, and thank you. And I just want to say from all of us at MAM, oh, this webinar, someone else says, this webinar was so amazing and insightful. Thank you all. And from us at MAM, Asia, we're so grateful you were able to be here tonight. Thank you for all of your insights and your sharing. And we wish you all the best in your new adventure. We're going to miss you in Montana, but definitely we'll keep in touch.
Absolutely, and I'm sure I'll visit it. It's too beautiful not to.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you so much.